Hi, everybody, and welcome to our regularly scheduled multi-tenancy working group for Kubernetes. Today we have Lukas on. He's going to talk about Loft and their virtual cluster technology that they're open sourcing. And then Harsh is going to go over an open issue in the hierarchical namespaces project. So Lukas, would you like to kick off?
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, I think last time we spoke was in December, so it's actually been a while. Last time we talked about the virtual cluster implementation as part of our commercial product called Loft. And, you know, when we last spoke, we had the plans to open source it, but it wasn't open source yet. So I guess we couldn't dive as deep into what we actually built under the hood as we wanted to share it with the SIG. Yeah, a couple of weeks ago we did it and actually open sourced our implementation. You can find it on vcluster.com. There's a GitHub repository as well, and you know, we're happy to share any insights and see where we can potentially join forces, work on you know, different things together that, you know, both projects can essentially build upon, because I think there's a lot of interest in virtual clusters, and it's probably going to be, you know, growing over the next, you know, maybe 12 months or so, because there are a lot of use cases for virtual clusters, and I assume there will be other projects appearing as well, you know, with certain opinionated you know, views on what a virtual cluster should look like and how to actually implement it. And, you know, we just want to be, I think my CTO Fabian is in the call as well. You know, as Loft Labs, we just want to be part of that journey and essentially contribute wherever we can. That's essentially why we, you know, open source vCluster, and I reached out to, you know, join another call here.
Awesome. Yeah. So I know that in the original conversation that we were having, there was a lot about sort of being super interested in seeing virtual cluster and how it might align with the upstream virtual cluster work that we're doing. So Faye, did you have any thoughts about how the two projects might work together?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have Lukas and I and Fabio had some offline discussion in the Slack channel. I believe the architecture-wise, from the user perspective, we provide the same, you know, the user experience in the sense that user got kind of in-act, you know, Kubernetes clusters for their workloads. So both of us just focused on the reducing the integration cost and make it as a black box supporting any user application operator, CRD, etc. So the holding difference is in terms of the implementation. The biggest challenge for us, I think, for combining everything is the namespace. So in virtual cluster, we were designing. I was thinking keeping the API capability as much as possible. So that's the reason I pretty much choose to think every namespace in the virtual cluster to the supermaster. Loft doing a slightly different way in the sense that they combine all objects into from the one tenant into one namespace. So, well, this is the biggest architectural differences. If we want to combine effort, I would say this is the biggest blocker. So, yeah, I don't know. So Lukas, do you have any thoughts about that? Is this completely necessary, or you guys want to? So, I don't think, you know, making the virtual cluster to support both mode is the right path because it's complicated a lot of things. And I don't see it as really necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you said, that's probably the biggest, you know, kind of hurdle about actually sharing things, because, yeah, I mean, so I see advantages of both approaches essentially. To kind of summarize my thoughts, so I think the, I mean, like you said, essentially creating several namespaces for each namespace in the virtual cluster, in the underlying host cluster, right? That is closer to the Kubernetes API way of doing things. The reason why we decided to essentially bundle all resources created in a virtual cluster in one underlying namespace and essentially map them to a single namespace is because we wanted to have this a virtual cluster more self-contained. That's also one of the reasons why we don't require any kind of special privileges to deploy the virtual cluster. So our approach, and that's kind of, I guess historically from where we're coming from, we're building a product that essentially lets organizations create a self-service experience for Kubernetes for their engineers, right? So essentially, if you're an engineer with Loft, you can spin up namespaces, right, in shared Kubernetes clusters. And then once you hit the limits of namespace and you need to do things across namespaces, but your network policy doesn't allow you to do that because it isolates each namespace, then you're running into issues, right? And then it's kind of nice to be able to spin up a virtual cluster. And you can do that within that restricted namespace. That's essentially a major use case for us. And that's why we opted for, the kind of single namespace approach rather than, n namespaces in the virtual cluster mapped to n namespaces in the underlying cluster. But I do see your points of having certain advantages, especially regarding network policies, right? It's going to be pretty hard for us to reflect network policies when we're mapping to a single namespace. Whereas for you, it's basically just having namespaces with different names, and you can still have network policies that, regulate the traffic between these namespaces essentially in the underlying cluster. But yeah, I think that is the biggest architectural difference.
Yeah, I see. I think it's because of I see your point. So we probably trying to solve the things from different point of view. So when I first think about a virtual cluster, so I trying to hide the supercluster, the underlying cluster as much as possible. So that's a reason. But you probably go with a different route. So people were accessing the underlying one, and they see the limitation, and they trying to expand that capability. I don't know if you, in your model, the user still can access, manipulate the underlying cluster or not, or they just get a pure VC view. Everything they can do is within the VC scope.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's more the use case. Typically, folks have access to their namespaces, and that's kind of the self-service experience that our product provides. And then when they need more than just a namespace, then they spin up a virtual cluster inside of it, but they still have access to the underlying namespace.
Yeah, I think that's the major differences because
I think what you're aiming at is spinning up virtual clusters directly without access to the namespace, right? Yeah. That's essentially where you're coming from.
Yeah, because I was trying to model the underlying cluster as a pod provider only. So that's my abstraction. And now I see the differences because of the usage model.
Would hierarchical namespaces be able to help here? Because they do support a self-serve model where you could spin up some more namespaces. The naming wouldn't be correct. You'd have to have some kind of auto-generated name. But if there's a mapping layer, which I assume there must be, you could do that without cluster permissions.
I think, to be honest, our approach to virtual clusters is probably a mix between what Faye is doing and what hierarchical namespaces is doing, right? Because we're essentially creating a virtual cluster that has n namespaces and mapping it to one namespace in the underlying cluster, right? Which seems pretty similar in terms of the mapping that hierarchical namespaces does.
It's not quite the same because hierarchical namespaces are real namespaces, like they are real namespaces on the cluster.
Right.
And so, but it supports a creation and deletion model that doesn't require cluster level privileges. You have something similar in Capsule, right? Do you not? Or is that
kiosk?
Kiosk, sorry. What's the difference between Kiosk and Capsule again? Are they related? Or am I mixing them up?
I think Capsule is a different open source project solving the same thing that Kiosk does. I think what Capsule does is they're an operator and they have CRDs, whereas we solve the self-service problem with an API server extension. So we basically have the resource. Exactly, we add the resource called space, and although you don't have the permission to create namespaces, you do have the permission to list, create, delete spaces that you own, essentially.
I see. Okay. Yeah, it's a thought if you wanted to reconcile the two virtual cluster models, that hierarchical namespaces might be able to fit there if you need to map to an underlying to a real namespace on the cluster, but you don't want to have cluster level privileges. I think that might be something that could be worth looking into. I'm obviously there to assist if you want to do that, but I don't know enough about virtual clusters of either variety to really lead that. It's just a thought.
Yeah, it's probably something I would need to look into myself, because I actually have not played with hierarchical namespace controller yet. I'd probably have to play around with it first to actually know if it could help in that direction.
Yeah, there's a quick start. Look up the concept called sub-namespaces. Sub-namespaces is how we handle the self-service model. It's pretty straightforward. There are some weird edge cases, but the basic idea is not too complicated. So yeah, just give me a shout if you have any questions.
I'll do that for sure. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, Lucas. So do you guys? Namespace is one aspect. So when we first designed the VC, we were thinking about support more isolation like CRD stuff. So do you hit that problem? So because that is kind of major blocker to using namespace anyway.
So for the essentially for the admin of a virtual cluster to be able to install CRDs, or
yeah, do they want to have a capability of install CRD? So
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean that's one of the. I mean there are a couple of use cases for virtual clusters as we see it, and one of them obviously being doing things across namespaces, even though you're running in a isolated environment where each namespace kind of is for its own. And another one is everything related to CRDs, whether that be I want to install my
another question is sorry, so I probably should look at the code, but how do you guys handle the nodes? So do you expose everything up or just some nodes?
That's actually a super interesting question. Yeah, so by default, we'll just show you one node from the underlying cluster. And there is the option to also provide a node selector to essentially, reflect multiple of the underlying cluster's nodes. I mean, regarding nodes, you can add actually a lot of complexity. But we're just at the start of this, right? So there are a lot of feature requests regarding extending that capability.
Yeah. So in current virtual cluster, what we was currently doing is expose any node that you have a virtual pod running on it. So basically, if you have a pod running on the underlying cluster, I will expose that node into the virtual cluster. So that's the reason that's the reason I want to do that, to keep the node semantic as compatible as possible. So if you set pod and affinity, you will see 2V node in your VC. That's my own part. So because I was trying to resolve the problem from the compatibility perspective as much as possible. That's the reason I also want to ask, because I do see a lot of people ask a lot of things, but it's all about the usage model. So does your customer, or do you have use case that they want to run their own scheduler instead of the default one?
No, we haven't heard any requests in that direction. We have heard requests about kind of faking nodes or faking capabilities of nodes and stuff like that to test stuff, but not switch out the schedule itself. But that's kind of interesting what you're saying. So you essentially add nodes to the virtual cluster on demand once pods get scheduled on the respective node, right?
Yes, and we have GC algorithm. So if your pod is gone, your vnode will be gone in a few minutes. So I want to make it as kind of like an elastic experience in terms of capacity. So that's more like service ends of thing. Because of this, follow my philosophy of modeling things. I want to model the supercluster as the pod resource provider as much as possible. So if you from that aspect, this looks more reasonable in the sense that, if I don't run any node, if I don't run any pods, I will see no pods. I will see no virtual nodes in my virtual cluster.
Interesting. And do you? I mean, is there a way for is there a way in the syncer to kind of enforce?
Yeah, we have
certain nodes.
Yeah, enforce certain nodes. So basically, in the upstream version, we don't do that, but honestly, internally, we did something like this. But this is not standard way. You can extend it by yourself. But I don't want to do it upstream, make the entire logic very complicated. Yes,
right.
Yeah, you can say I want to expose certain nodes to VC, but it depends. In my current design, if the supercluster doesn't own doesn't own by the particular VC owner anyway, so there's no point to expose the nodes. But if you're doing the other run, especially in your case, in the sense that the VC user probably can access the supercluster and see all the nodes, so they probably want to expose those nodes.
So maybe. Well, Hey, I'm Fabian. I'm the CTO Lukas mentioned before. So maybe like a quick addition to what Lukas said. So currently the V cluster does not require cluster access at all. So we don't create like a cluster role, which also means the V cluster cannot list nodes in the host cluster, obviously, because a node is a cluster-wide resource, and if you don't have any cluster-wide permission, you cannot list any nodes as well, which is why by default, vCluster fakes nodes. So essentially, it's a little bit similar to what you are doing, except that the node status and node spec and stuff like that, that's all like fake information, except for like the node name itself, which we can obtain by the pod spec, because the node name is in there. So we create the node basically on demand as soon as there is a pod within the virtual cluster that has a node name that is not yet in the virtual cluster. Then we create a fake node for it. We also have a different option, which is what Lukas mentioned. So there are actually different ways how you can create nodes within vCluster. So this fake nodes is like the first way of doing it. But then we also allow you to turn off these fake nodes and actually sync the real data of nodes. But then you have to create a cluster role for the vCluster. But then it's essentially working the same way as you described it, Faye. So we just sync like the information about the real node instead of like faking the information. And besides that, we also allow you to create either a node selector to enforce like syncing only of certain nodes. And there's also the options to sync all nodes, because one thing we figured, or people were asking us, so I'm not sure if you handling this or if like you don't want to handle this, but currently we had a hard time with like daemon sets, because like if you schedule a daemon set within the virtual cluster, you kind of need to see like which nodes are there. Otherwise, it's pretty hard for the controller to schedule those pods really on the nodes if they are not there in the virtual cluster. That's why we also allow you to sync like all nodes if you want to.
Yeah. So in upstream version, so I clearly mentioned the limitation of a daemon set because we cannot.
Oh, okay.
But in the internally, we kind of have the option like you said. So just expose everything up, and then you have it. Then you can have the daemon set.
Is there like a is there like a reasoning behind why you don't allow daemon sets? I mean, from a security standpoint, we are also not so we don't recommend you to do that.
It's all, because it's about the use case about the daemon set. So because in our model, as I said, I want to completely hide the supercluster. So basically, it is modeled as a pod provider. So daemon set most likely it will just work on the nodes. Since I want to hide the node, so there's no. I know some people require that, but if you think about it from the pure service perspective, so you shouldn't, for example, you shouldn't ask to run some daemon set in AWS, right? So AWS won't give all access anyway. So why do you need a daemon set? So I understand other daemon set, for example, they want a special CNI or CSI plugin kind of thing. I can imagine that, but I don't support it right away. Sorry. So that's the reason. So
I wondered just more generically at the Kubernetes level, is there a use case for a user-focused daemon set? Their daemon set seems to be really focused around like sysadmins trying to load, log shippers or drivers or something across the entire cluster. But is there, maybe there's even outside of like virtual cluster or something, is there a use case for a daemon set for an admin of a namespace where they might want to launch a log shipper on any node that they have a pod running on or something, where it's a subset of the cluster, but it's slightly different than a daemon set, but similar. And maybe that use case is kind of the same thing as we're talking about here.
In terms of daemon set, as far as I know, so some very common, besides of load daemon, if you don't load management, that's one type of daemon. Another side of daemon set is do something around the image, because for example, they want to fasten the image pooling, so they want to upload some images. And I also know some daemon sets.
There's another project under the CNCF. I can't remember the name of it. It's open something starts with a K.
Open
Crew.
Open Cruise?
Yes, I think they have an actual API for pulling an image to all the nodes.
Yeah. I was in that Open Cruise.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so that's exactly what I was talking about in the Open Cruise use case. Everything besides of image pooling, so I don't see a strong use case that is completely running user application requires a daemon set. Maybe, yeah, if anybody knows anything about this, so they want to run something.
I mean, every time I've seen this, they generally want some sort of privilege access to do something at the OS level.
Yeah, like, you have to have a host mount of some kind,
right,
and then it's game over anyway.
Right, so that's, yeah, I don't think there's a legitimate use on a shared cluster that anyone would realistically give you.
The only one I could maybe think of is some way to like launch your own log shippers for your own logs. And logs are kind of painful right now if you're not the cluster admin, but still want to gather just like your logs.
Yeah, maybe Fabius, do you have use cases that people want to use daemon set but not for maintenance purpose?
Maybe. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but like maybe the daemon set, like I'm not sure if that's like something you want support, but like a virtual cluster within a virtual cluster. And I know you have like this VN agent, which is essentially a daemon set, right? As far as I stood that correctly.
Well, that daemon set is hidden from the user. So and that we have a lot of
Yeah, but if you want to install like a virtual cluster within a virtual cluster, let's say you want to,
that is
that would be use case, or wouldn't it? I'm not sure.
good. Okay.
Why would you want a vCluster in a vCluster?
And wouldn't you want a vCluster?
Why
in a
not?
vCluster?
Yeah.
So I mean, well, but realistically, if, as Faye said, you try to hide the fact that you're in a virtual cluster. So if someone thinks they have a Kubernetes cluster themselves, they may try to do some of those tools. Because I mean, virtual cluster isn't the only one that would want to deploy something if they're treating this as their own bespoke Kubernetes cluster instead of underlying a shared one, right?
I mean, unless you are offering Kubernetes as a service, I wouldn't have thought that would come up too terribly often. That's the only.
Yeah. So
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, in my original thought, yeah, I do see one use case is one tenant want to, for example, they although the super cluster is a pod provider, one virtual cluster can negotiate with a cluster and say, hey guys, I want 2 or 3 dedicated nodes, please, my product need it. And if you go with that round, then we can do is expose a part of the nodes up for that VC. So that is one use case I can think of, and probably will happen in some production environments. That regards, if you do that way, then you can run daemon sets on those vNode. That you don't have any problem.
I mean, it probably comes down to a similar thing with hierarchical namespace controller, right? I mean, who would have thought we needed that kind of nested self-service namespace approach like 3 or 4 years back? Probably 3 years down the road, you know, people would say like, hey, getting virtual clusters is great. Now I want virtual clusters whenever I need them. And then that could be a solution to it.
Yeah, I view them a little bit differently. Like, first of all, I mean, I think there's a limit to how many levels of hierarchical namespaces you'd want. That limit's probably somewhere between 3 and 5. And the reason for that is that it's supposed to mirror the, let's call it the relevant organizational structure that you're dealing with. So you could have teams and subteams and microservices. So that's like 3. Maybe you add 1 more on top of that. That gets you to 4. More than 1 is useful. More than 5 is probably not. And when I think about a virtual,
then you add then you add a cloud provider and a reseller, and you're
yeah, and that's the only case where I can imagine a vCluster and a vCluster is where is where like the base layer is completely opaque. Like if you're at an organization and they have the base cluster, which I think was the Apple model, if I'm not mistaken, it's like, you know, your platform team is running the base cluster, and then you get a vCluster inside of that. You probably, there's no need to subdivide that further because you would just go back to the platform team and ask for another cluster. Whereas the model for hierarchical namespaces is totally different. Like you're literally inheriting things, which probably isn't as relevant for vCluster.
Yeah.
But yeah, if the base layer is at a completely different company, then I can see wanting that.
One thing to consider though, right, is if we don't support like a daemon set or something else, like you can't pass conformance testing. And so
Right.
It really comes down to a question of like, is your virtual cluster providing conformant Kubernetes clusters or subsets? Sorry, my dog wants to go outside. But it's worth I guess pointing out, if you don't support those, then you can't pass conformant. So then you're not really providing a quote unquote Kubernetes cluster, but a subset.
It is not that you cannot run daemon set. You still can run daemon set. The whole problem is how do you expose the nodes up? So if you only expose 1 node up, you probably can only run your daemon in 1 node, but that is probably not the people want. So you probably can you can still pass a conformance test, but the whole problem is I don't think that conformance test is written in a way that they create 3 nodes and they run daemon set and confirm that you have 3 parts. They probably just use 1 node. And if that is the case, you still can pass it. The whole problem is for daemon sets, how many nodes? I mean, so what exactly that runs inside the daemon? So what are the nodes they want to touch base? and especially if the pods need node permissions, do you guys want to give that node permissions or not?
Sorry, are you referring to us?
No. I'm asking. I'm not asking.
Oh, that's just like a general question.
Yeah, I'm just saying that from the conformance test perspective, maybe even if we claim we don't support daemon set, but that support doesn't mean that you cannot pass conformance test. The whole problem is the use of daemon sets is pretty powerful, or I would say is very detailed. You need to have the permission to the nodes in the first place. That's
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you need a pod security policy or something else that allows the pod to do the useful things that it's intended to do. So I can't see a case where I'd ever configure the pod security policy or something enough that would allow somebody to do that. But I don't think it's necessarily like blocked. You know, it's not a blocker. I mean, if somebody were to give enough permissions to somebody in another cluster, you know, a virtual cluster to be able to do that, I think it would work and it would be okay. Right. It's maybe not something that we need to actively like prevent from working, but it's not something that most people would configure to allow either.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we already spent, I want to give some time for the other topic, but for now, I think, Lucas, actually, you guys have a good point. I think we just trying to solve the problem, but from different angles. I don't see a strict, you know, requirement say we have to merge roles. I don't think so, because of how the usage model is kind of different. We probably should, in terms of writing or whatever, just make sure people understand the differences.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you know, I guess, you know, if there is I guess there's two variations of a syncer, right?
Yeah.
It's a one-to-one versus a one-to-n syncer, and that's probably what we should kind of communicate to people so they understand what's happening behind the scenes, because I guess, I mean, the syncer is really the most complicated part.
Yeah, maybe just the abstraction model, because so I probably have to mention that more in the virtual cluster. I want to, as I said, so in our model, I want to abstract the entire underlying cluster as a pod provider only. There's no any other functionality at all, just pod provider. But in your case, you want to be that more powerful, so people has more control on that cluster as well. So that's probably the primary differences. Okay, so Tasha, maybe next topic. So I don't want to hold the entire thing for VC.
Yeah, absolutely. Good conversation.
Yeah, that was interesting. One thing, I'm not exactly sure about the use cases, because like for the previous topic itself, for example, it can always be debated, like, should it really belong to the namespace level, or should the platform team deploy it to the cluster level? Because, for example, one project that came to my mind was Node Problem Director, which basically like reads the logs of system logs and alerts based on it. So if but again, it can be debated. But is it like possible in either of the V clusters to just spin up or sync nodes based on the number of instances that were required in the daemon set?
Sorry, say that again.
Like if the daemon set has like 3, like the count is 3, then is there a way like either of the V clusters can import like 3 of the nodes and just start deploying it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a big problem of exposed nodes. So it's just like we need to have a policy or kind of design. So which are the nodes we want to expose? it is okay. You
Oh, right.
expand the virtual cluster saying, you just change the sync or add a new API. So this set of the node selector needs to be exposed to certain VC. That's certainly completely doable. So we don't do that in the place because we think it is kind of more opinionated option that people can do. I don't want to fully support it in upstream because to me it seems like it's kind of it's a variation, but I don't want to put every variation into the single upstream repo because of the so we want to make our story consistent and make sure the project grow as it fits for many people's needs.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. The issue I mentioned in the agenda has to do with hierarchical namespaces, and like basically the motivation for this was like this currently only one global HNC configuration per cluster, and I wanted to propagate like different things in each of the configs. Like basically, like one of the configs would have secrets and custom resources, whereas the others would have just the secrets or maybe secrets and config or something. It could be something entirely different also. So basically, I wanted two HNC configurations, but after I had a chat with Adrian, like he explained like why it could be too complicated and not easy to implement. So then what I realized is like maybe it would be better if the global configuration can have exception support, not just for a particular resource, but for an entire GVK.
So what would that? So already in the global configuration, you specify like what GVK are actually these days. It's group resource. What group resource like V1 secrets. So the global one already says like which resource types get propagated and which ones don't. We've talked about allowing that per namespace. But then you get problems like what if there's a conflict and what if a namespace moves from one hierarchy to another? And so that's what I mentioned in the issue, which I just pasted into the link there. So I think all of these problems are solvable. But what's missing right now is a couple of things. What's missing is like what's a full description of like exactly why we're trying to do what we do? Like if we understand, like it's one thing to say, well, I'd like secrets to be propagated in this tree, but not in that tree. Whereas a tree is a tree of namespaces. It's one thing to say that. It would be a little bit more useful if I could understand like exactly why. Is it because like there are two different teams and one team is working in this way and another team's working in that way, or is it because they're not different teams but they're being used for different purposes? Like just the more we know, the more it might be useful. But even if we decide, okay, yeah, we really do just want like per tree configuration, then we just need to answer these questions like what happens if a namespace moves from one tree to another, or what happens if a parent's configuration conflicts with a child configuration, or do you only allow this configuration at the root? And then what happens if something that was a root moves and is no longer a root? So it's like there's a lot of edge cases, and this is kind of like what I was saying to Lukas. It's like these things are all quite easy in theory, and they're easy to sort of make the happy path work. But we do need to think through all of these edge cases as well and get a short document that explains how these things are going to work and just agree on that before we sort of set out to actually implement anything. Does that all make sense?
Yes, I think it does. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know where you want to take like do you want to tell us a little bit more maybe about why you want this, like why you want that kind of flexibility in the different things?
So basically, the idea was to have like I mentioned, like the different teams. So it wouldn't make sense like like if I had two projects installed, and so basically I was thinking in this way that if I had these two separate projects installed, and each of these projects they have nothing to do with each other, and I just want to propagate the objects of the first project to the first config, and the second project to the second config. And yeah.
So sorry, what is a project in this case?
It could be any project, and those projects could have their own custom resources. So the config A could propagate the custom resource of the project A, and the config B could propagate the custom resource of the project B. So this could allow users to, like, the projects, it would enable the projects itself to have this structure where they can just have this config per namespace, and users of that users just have to create one namespace for that project, and everything else will be handled by the project based on the sub namespaces of that project. This does assume that, like, the root namespace doesn't change. I think that's, like, the major assumption in this case.
Right. So two things very quickly. If they're CRDs, the CRDs still need to be created at the cluster level, because that's something that hierarchical namespaces doesn't give you. It doesn't give you, like, per namespace CRDs. We looked and tried to figure out if there was any feasible way we could get that done, and the answer was basically no. You have to use virtual clusters. So you're already doing a cluster level configuration. And so I guess the question I would ask is given that you already need a cluster level config to add a CRD, why couldn't you just turn on propagation globally for that CRD? Like, what would be the case where I could see a case where a CRD is relevant to one, let's say, team or set of namespaces, but not another? But are there cases where it is, like, critical that propagation be turned off for some people, as opposed to they just don't use it?
Right. Like, what could happen is, like, the team A would, like, the project A would have its own credentials and configurations, which would be passed down, and
okay.
Those, like, it might not be a good idea to expose those that information to the other namespace, which has another project running. So and
Yeah, but you get
another
that.
team could be using that. Yeah. So.
But you get that today, right?
Segregation.
Like, if you have two root namespaces, you put the credentials in one root namespace. They only get propagated to the descendants of that one namespace. They don't get propagated to the other one, right?
Okay. I'm thinking of a good example.
I mean,
A picture might be helpful here. Sorry, what's that, Ryan?
I was gonna say, I mean, I could say one of our use cases, which is slightly different of an ask, but one of our common use cases is we really only want, like, one resource propagated out. Like, our big one is, we have a private CA that we use, so we like to put the public chain in every namespace so that everyone can add it to their containers, to the trust store, so we don't have issues. And so we really, like, want one config map propagated down. And so in order to achieve that, we basically have to configure all config maps, and then it basically achieve that. So that's, like, one use case. It's slightly different, but it's a common use case that we have. It's like, we just want a way to get everything everywhere. But, and there's not a good way to do an exception. You can only do an exception per config map, not like the other way around.
Right. Yeah, and that one I think is relatively easy. If you want to add that, that should be pretty easy to add, because you just, right now, I think we have three modes, which are propagate, remove, or ignore. And Ryan, you and I have discussed this. It would be fairly easy to add an allow propagate, where basically, like, propagation is by exception only. And so, like, it's default off, but you can turn it on. That would be pretty easy to do, but you can still do that globally, like, across the entire cluster. And I think that would be pretty straightforward. Like, it would still be nice to have a design doc, or maybe extend the existing design doc. That's pretty straightforward to do. Harsh, to get back to what you were saying, it's like, I appreciate that in your use case, you basically only care about static stuff, which is to say, like, well, I don't care what happens if two namespaces change, like, if a namespace changes its ancestors, because I'm not going to do that.
Right.
That's fine, but we still need to define what's going to happen. So, for example, let's say that you move one namespace with one set of propagations to another with a different set. Is that an error? Is that going to be prevented? how will the user allow that? Like, it doesn't have to be a great user experience because we don't know what a good user experience is, but we do need to know what the experience is going to be, and we need to know that like and we need to know that we're not like locking ourselves into we're not painting ourselves into a corner so that we can't get out of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, I thought about a good example. Maybe this can help. So, like, if let's say the project A requires the secrets to be propagated across this namespace, right? Like, which the project creates, and the project B doesn't require any secret to be propagated, and
Right.
it wouldn't, it wouldn't be good idea to like propagate secrets which were created in project B, just because project A wanted it. So.
What about what Ryan said? Would that help if we basically had an allow propagate mode where basically it would be opt-in? So you could still say like by default secrets are never being propagated, but you can add an annotation to any individual secret and that would force it to be propagated. That would fit very well in what we have now without having a per namespace configuration. Would that suit your needs?
Kind of. I was thinking like if we could do it at the GVK level itself, like instead of every resource level, would that be possible, or would that make it more complicated?
Well, it's already at the GVK level. Oh, you mean like within a namespace?
Yeah. So like we just mentioned that this namespace would propagate, like would not allow this GVK to be propagated. But I'm not sure like what would happen if we change the ancestral path and all that.
Yeah, and that's the complication. Like what we're saying, like to solve Ryan's case, where we say we are allowed to turn propagation on in any, for a secret, for example, anywhere, but then you have to use an additional, an annotation on the secret if you actually want it to be propagated. That
Right.
we understand very well. Like we already know how object overwriting happens when you move from one place to another. Like if a namespace moves from one place to another, that's already handled very well and it's quite robust. If you want to do it at the GVK level per namespace, then you need to worry about what happens if the parent has the mode propagate, but the child is allow propagate. Which one wins? Which one loses? What happens if one of them is like removed? That's when it becomes really, really hard or not necessarily really, really hard, but that's where it becomes non-trivial, and we need answers for all of these questions. And so that's all I'm saying is that I don't have the answers to them. And if you want to, so like the way we've done development before, I'm going to paste something into the chat. Like this was the doc that we used to actually add exceptions to HNC in the first case. And you can see actually that the first link there in that doc is the original design doc for HNC. And that one's much longer. I try to stick to much shorter design docs these days. Like we have single purpose design docs now. But we're going to need a design doc that sort of says how are these things going to happen, and they don't have to be long. So you can see like the exceptions design doc is only, it's only 5 pages and it's got like one picture and a couple of, so it doesn't have to be like massive, but it does need to exist. And so that's really the next step. If you want to add this feature, have a design doc where we actually can go through these details and you say like, this is what I'm trying to achieve. And say, this is how I expect these corner cases to work, and then we can start writing PRs once we agree on that. So it's not a heavyweight process. Basically, like if I like it and Brian likes it and we're like, okay, yeah, that's good, you can go ahead, then we can just then you can go ahead and start implementing it, and Ryan and I will we'll like review all of the PRs, and that's fine, but we do need to understand like what we're driving towards.
If I could add quickly, on top of that, it might not hurt to look at like another tool to, I guess, extend HNC, because I think if we did have the allow exception, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see Jim on, but I think Adrian, you looking at this, Kyverno does support mutating policies. So you could do like an allow and then use a Kyverno policy at a namespace level to enforce the propagation, or vice versa, even without the allow. You can use a Kyverno policy to mutate to add in a removal. So there are, I think, other tools that exist that may be able to achieve what you want without any actual changes to agency.
If we have allow.
Correct. Well, I think even, yeah.
And I think that's definitely an option in the short term. I'm certainly not opposed to having per namespace configs. As I said, we've discussed it many times, and it's just like we just need a concrete proposal. So Harsh, if you want to, I think that's the next step, is just going ahead and writing that doc and sharing it, and we can iterate on it. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect. If you want to start with something that's 2 pages and then just say like, hey, what do you think I'm missing? I can sketch in a couple of questions, and then you can sketch in some answers, and we can iterate. So like, it's a very lightweight process, but we do need to get it down. So do you want to take the action to do that next?
Right. I'm just thinking, like, would it be a bad experience for the, let's say, the project maintainers, like, to enable like whatever secrets they are creating? Like let's take the simple example of a secret, and so if the project maintainer is creating a secret on behalf of the user, or the user is creating a secret for that project, then just adding an annotation which mentions that the HNC, like, which lets HNC know that this can be propagated. I think that's a good solution too. Like,
I think that's the use case that Ryan was talking about, the key ones, right?
yeah, exactly, yeah.
And that's going to be fairly
I think
straightforward to implement. Yeah, and that I think would be very straightforward fairly straightforward to implement. You could probably just go back to that very design doc that I just shared, the exceptions one, and basically propose some changes to that doc and say like, yeah, we've got 3 modes in here. We're adding a 4th one called allow, and here's how it's going to work, and then can go ahead and start that. We can probably Ryan and I can probably approve that fairly quickly if that's the path you want to go down. But it would be a lot simpler to implement and a lot faster.
Yes. So I think I'll go with that part. So I'll have to look. I'll go through this doc briefly, and then get back to you on Slack.
Okay, that sounds great. And yeah, if you want to start proposing some changes to that doc, or if you just want to write a second doc, which is like a 1 or 2 pager, just saying like, here's what we want to do, and then we can roll it all into the main doc. Up to you how you want to do that.
Sure.
Okay, great. And if it doesn't work and you decide you need to go back and do like the per namespace configs, then that's fine too. It's just those are the problems that we're going to have to deal with.
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I'm afraid I have to run to my next meeting, but thanks for that discussion.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone. Sorry, I got to run. See you later.
I got